For the third reading this morning, I've actually chosen a piece that I wrote on the 23rd of October in the year 2001 because it feeds right into the topic I want to address in the homily this morning. I call it The Time Before. God began to dim the lights in my outdoor bedroom at precisely 6:05 p.m. this evening. I watched his retreating figure make its way downwards behind the western mountains. It would be another hour before total darkness engulfed me. In the meantime, I could see the ever-diminishing glow of his sun lamp. He did, however, leave me the half-moon as a nightlight. I stood up on my outdoor bed atop Meditation Rock, raised my arms aloft and soulfully sang the Lord's Prayer in Gaelic. Then I shouted after him, "Tell me a bedtime story." He chuckled, and over his shoulder he said, "I'll send you a dream instead." "Promise?" I pleaded. "As sure as God is my witness," he fired back. And he was as good as his word. Here is the dream that he sent me. I am a newborn human infant, gurgling happily in awe of this new home of mine. The oceanic bliss of the uterine darkness has now become a fairyland of lights and sounds, tastes and smells, feelings and emotions. I am lying on my back. 4 long tentacles are waving above me, each of them ending in 5 lesser tentacles. They're fascinating. They seem to be dancing to some divine music, weaving and undulating to an inaudible melody. Every so often, one of them approaches me, and I grasp it in my mouth and suck appreciatively. But the music demands that it eventually be released to join its fellows in the wild. Now, I am suddenly caught up in a time vortex that plummets me back at dizzying speed into an earlier era of my DNA. I am a newborn plant, smiling ecstatically at the sun in awe of this new home of mine. The oceanic bliss of the subsoil's darkness has now become a fairyland of light and sensation. I am standing erect, having pushed myself aloft from rooted legs. Many long tentacles are waving above me, each of them ending in green, heart-shaped petals whose cores are yellow flowers. They are fascinating. They seem to be dancing to some divine music, weaving and undulating to an inaudible melody. Every so often, one of them approaches me and I smell its fragrance. But the music demands that it eventually be released to join its fellows in the wild. Once again, I am suddenly caught up in time in a vortex that plummets me back at dizzying speed into a still earlier era of my DNA. I am a newborn sea anemone, moving sensually in the warm waters, in awe of this new home of mine. The fairyland of the life-smith has now become an oceanic bliss of deep, silent ecstasy. I am holding tenaciously to a rock. Silk-sided tentacles, choreographed by invisible curtains, are waving above me, each of them ending in multicolored fingertips. They are fascinating. They seem to be dancing to some divine music, weaving and undulating to an inaudible melody. Every so often, one of them approaches me bearing a gift, which I pop into my mouth. I lick the residual taste on the generous fingertip, but the music demands that it eventually be released to join its fellows in the wild. For the third time, I am suddenly caught up in a time vortex that plummets me back at dizzying speed to the earliest time of my DNA. I am a newborn star, beaming brilliantly into the pristine darkness in awe of this new home of mine. The fairyland of the sunsmith has now become the interstellar void of deep intergalactic space. I am pulsating with light and with life. Million-mile-long tentacles, obedient to the baton of the windmaster of the cosmos, are waving above me, each of them ending in rainbow-colored solar flares. Waving lengths of light, wavelengths of light. They are fascinating. They seem to be dancing to some divine music, weaving and undulating to an inaudible melody. Every so often, one of them approaches me, and I wrap it comfortingly about me. But the music demands that it eventually be released to join its fellows in the wild. For the final time, I am suddenly caught in a time vortex that plummets me back at dizzying speed to the earliest era before there was DNA. The last glint of light from God's retreating lamp went out. On my bed top, atop meditation rock, there was utter silence and total darkness. Then God whispered, "Now, do you see?" Words inspired by God. My brother Seamus has 8 kids. He's making up for me. He's got 6 girls and 2 boys. And 2 of the girls emigrated to Holland many, many years ago. And they fell in love there, and they both married Dutch guys and started their families there. But last year, one of them decided to move her family back home to Ireland. The whole family came back to Ireland. And then this year, the second daughter, Aisling, came back with her family to Ireland as well. So Deirdre, who came back last year, when she came back, she had 2 kids. A little boy called Malcolm, who was 4 years old last year, and a little baby called Jane. And Malcolm is bilingual, obviously. He speaks Dutch and he speaks English. And now they had to find him a little school. They live in a kind of a country area, so they found a tiny little school, just a few kids there, and now Malcolm is learning Gaelic as well. So the very first day he went to school, his mother took him to school, and she picked him up in the afternoon. And he was totally, totally excited. And he says, "Mom, guess what? They're open again tomorrow. Can I go?" I don't know if his enthusiasm has survived a year or not. I have no idea. But he was so excited. He thought like school was just, you go there once and that's it. And he was so excited. He found out they're actually open again tomorrow. So can I go back? And so how many of you remember school that affectionately? Margaret, you did? I do, yes. Good for you. But I certainly didn't. Oh, brilliant. Awesome. So you got it by osmosis. Brilliant. Brilliant. So in the course of your education, most of us have gone through some version of, play school, kindergarten, nursery, grade school, high school, and maybe college. So we stepped ourselves through various levels of education. Now, suppose you were told at the end of nursery school, that's it, your education is over. There's nothing further to be learned and you're not going to go back to school anymore. There's a whole bunch of stuff you never would have learned, a lot of reactions you never would have had. But in some senses, that's what kind of materialistic science is expecting us to believe, that education ends at the end of nursery school. So when you look at the evolution of life on planet Earth, it seems to me it's gone through or going through 5 great stages. The first stage is matter. And matter and its properties are properly studied by chemistry and by physics. And then the next stage is life emerges, and it's studied, its issues and its laws are studied by biology. And then at some stage, mind evolved. And mind, and its laws are properly studied by psychology. But then there are 2 more stages. There is the soul. And the soul and its laws are properly studied by theology. And finally then, there is spirit. And spirit is properly studied or actually is experienced through mysticism. So we're only halfway through our school system. We're barely in the 3rd phase. Now, if you listen to materialistic science, most of them won't even believe that the mind exists. They claim that the mind is just an illusion created by the firing of neurons or biochemistry in the brain. So they want us to stop us at nursery school. The others will allow us to go to grade school, but not high school or college. And that's what I want to talk about today, because I believe that in the course of evolution, there are 5 great awakenings that need to happen. There is the awakening to the self. So the first great awakening is self-awareness. The second great awakening is awareness of others. The third great awakening is awareness of the transcendence of God. The fourth great awakening is the awareness of the immanence of God. And the last great awakening is awakening to unity consciousness. And so that's what I'm going to talk about this morning. I'm going to make 5 quick main points this morning. I address each of these 5 areas. So the first great awakening, I believe, is awakening to the self. Because there's things out there that have no self-awareness, presumably. Presumably rocks are not aware of themselves. So at some stage, self-awareness became part of the equation. It was a great, great, great breakthrough. In fact, the scientific definition of life is that something is alive if it can do two things. If it can feed itself and breed. So feeding and breeding are the two marks, scientifically, of life. Any species that can feed itself and propagate its species is alive. Now, as a species, there may be individuals within it who can't do that. Obviously, a little baby is not able to propagate itself or even feed itself. Obviously, a paraplegic, although he belongs to a class of beings who are a life form, can't feed himself perhaps or propagate. So it's the species rather than the individual. But the definition of life scientifically is that there are two things present: feeding and breeding. These are the two things. Now, when you think about human beings, in some senses, the journey of the little baby, it begins, there's no sense of separate self for the little baby. And so in this piece that I wrote in 2001, the first image I had was the baby lying on his back with these four big tentacles waving over its head. Doesn't realize they're my legs and my hands. And occasionally one comes by and he sticks it in his mouth. And so the baby has no sense of self initially. But at some stage, it begins to develop. It's so wondrous for the child when there's the beginning of a sense of self. Now, the extraordinary thing is, a sense of self, I believe, is midwifed by pain and by pleasure. It's the experience of pain and the experience of pleasure that actually midwives the child's self-awareness into being. Before that, before the child is experiencing pain or pleasure, there's no sense of somebody to whom these things are happening. So that's actually a huge move forward when the child begins, to experience and be aware of. And then when the child begins to hear a name, at some stage, it makes the identification, that is I. And so the sense of separate self comes into being, an awareness of self. That's a huge movement. Rocks are not self-aware. They don't breed and they don't feed. Presumably, a mother mountain and a father mountain don't get together, and give birth to a whole bunch of hills. Or they don't go down to the local supermarket and buy a bunch of rocks and gorge themselves on rocks. So at some stage, a being comes into being, which is somehow self-aware. It's a huge movement. So what's the upside to that in the evolutionary trajectory? And the upside, obviously, is that life has taken an extraordinary leap forward in complexity and a great leap forward in beauty. Plant life, or the first cells, introduced a level of awareness and a level of beauty into the world that didn't exist before that. It introduced a level of complexity into the world that didn't exist before that. And for the child who's becoming self-aware, it's a much more interactive being once there's some level of self-awareness. Now, at this stage, still, there isn't awareness of others. So the child is not actually interacting with others. The child is interacting with aspects of itself. It sees its mother just as an extension of itself. It does not see it as other. It's just part of, ice cream, and this part of me appears with a nipple and milk. And so at this stage, the child is more interactive, but is still interacting only with itself. It doesn't understand other. Now, the downside, there's the upside: increased beauty, increased complexity. There's a downside to self-awareness at this stage of self-awareness, when there isn't awareness of others yet. And the downside is that these life forms that are only self-aware are very parasitic in how they conduct life. So, and you find this at every level. You find it in plant life. So there are plants that are just total parasites. So, for instance, mistletoe is a total parasite that lives on oak trees and just sucks them dry, contributing nothing of its own. It's not taking chlorophyll in like other plants are. Let's say poison oak is a vine that wraps itself around other trees, so it's a parasite in some senses. In the world of fauna, you find the same thing. Ticks and leeches, in some senses, are parasites. There's a sense of self, but not an appreciation of other. And when it comes to human beings, you get the same thing, that a parasitic life form is a life form that pulls from the environment but contributes nothing. And for the little infant, that's where it is initially, until there's a sense of other. Initially, the little baby really believes that the world is his, or there is only him, and everything that in the environment belongs to him, and he uses everything. So there's no way that you can be aware of the rights or the needs of others as long as you're locked into self-awareness. But it is a very necessary first stage. If the baby didn't experience that, he wouldn't survive. So the first stage is self-awareness almost equals selfishness. So because there is no sense of other. So So then the second great awakening has strangely enough, and the second great this process has begun, I believe, by the immune system. The immune system is the first part of us that recognizes what is me and what is not me. So there's a level of myself, it's a very unconscious level obviously initially, in which bacteria or viruses that invade me are recognized as being not me, as being other, and therefore the body is going to defend itself against those. And so the beginning of awareness of others begins really with, the immune system's reaction. When we start bringing it to consciousness, there's a game that parents love to play with the child. You've all done it with your babies, called peekaboo. And so the baby's in the coming, you go, and you're in, and the baby's, and then you're gone. And as far as the baby's concerned, you don't exist anymore. It's not that you're gone, you never existed. Because the child's brain still hasn't formed enough that it can retain a working memory of a sensation. So as long as there's a stimulation present to one of the senses, the baby can hold it. As soon as it's gone, it doesn't exist anymore. A baby at this age, if it were playing on the floor with a ball, and the ball rolled in under a closet, the child won't search for it. It doesn't exist anymore. Because when it's not being addressed by one of the senses, it really does not exist. And so the parents are trying to teach the child by playing peekaboo. Eventually, the child is going to make the kind of inference that maybe they're not gone completely when they're gone. Maybe they're just gone partially or something has changed, but they're not gone. So it's what's called in psychology object permanence, that a child can retain an image of an object which is not present to the senses right now. And it's a huge move forward in child psychology. So then the child begins to understand there is other out there. It's not just me. There is other. And then it begins to differentiate among the others. So by age about 8 months, the child may experience some kind of stranger anxiety. Because at this stage, not only is it identifying and recognizing others to self, but some are friendly, some I know, and some I don't know. So it's differentiating among the others. So this is a huge move forward for a child. Now, that is the upside then, that the child is able to engage meaningfully with others. So the upside then, when you see in the animal kingdom and the flora kingdom, is that partnership becomes possible and symbiosis becomes possible. And you find this at every level of life. So you find, for instance, that fungi, I can never pronounce that word correctly. Is it fungi or fungi? How do you pronounce it? Either one? Okay, I call it fungi in Ireland, but I hear fungi here. So you get the word. Okay, whatever it is. So fungi and trees have this symbiotic relationship. Fungi live underground, and therefore they don't have access to chlorophyll, which is delivered directly by sunlight. The trees are overground, and through photosynthesis, they take energy in from the sun, called chlorophyll, and they transmit it down to the fungi. And in response, the fungi feed them back nitrogens. So there's this great symbiotic effort, this partnership that's happening even among plants. I saw the same thing done again and again and again, very humorously in my time in Kenya. Lots of where I lived, lots of the wild animals. So occasionally, there was a lake near me called Lake Bogoria, with a huge crocodile population that I swam in very carefully on occasion. And occasionally you see these crocodiles out at the edge with their mouths wide open. And these tiny little birds would hop right into their mouths and start picking meat from between their teeth. Now, it wasn't that the crocodiles were going to trap them, it wasn't that. It was like the crocodile was getting free dental treatment, literally, because he couldn't take the stuff out and the birds were getting free food. So there was this extraordinary partnership where they picked the stuff out between the crocodile's teeth and the crocodile got a free dental treatment. I would see with buffaloes. Buffaloes are subject to a lot of kind of ticks, and these are blood-sucking ticks. And there was a kind of bird that would land on the back of the buffalo. I mean, you might see 4 or 5 on any buffalo's back, and the buffalo is just very happy because they're picking the ticks off the buffalo. They're eating it, and so the birds are getting a free feed, and the buffalo is getting a free grooming. So again, you have this partnership becomes possible. And in the human arena, once we develop self-awareness, for the first time ever, there's the possibility of developing compassion. Now a child, because it's aware of others, as partners, can develop compassion for the others. But there's a downside to the second phase as well, to this awareness of others. And that is that once you recognize there are others, you begin to see them either as competitors or enemies or a threat. And you find this all throughout life again, the animal kingdom and every place else. So competitors, you say, kids and families where there's sibling rivalries. So little Johnny arrives, in this case, little baby Jane arrives, and now Malcolm is 4. How's Malcolm going to react to the arrival of Jane? Because everybody is fussing over little Jane. So what's Malcolm going to feel at this stage? So the competitor has arrived. So as soon as we become aware of others, there's the element of competition comes in. And you see this very definitely in the savannas of East Africa, where lions and hyenas and wild dogs are all competing for the same food sources. And so sometimes they become enemies. And you see this ritualized kind of warfare that happens before there are actual real skirmishes. And so, for instance, the rhinos where I lived, rhinos had big territory, which they would circumambulate to protect. And they'd poop every few yards and a huge big perimeter to decide to tell people, this is my terrain, don't come in here. Now, if you know the formula, the circumference of a circle is pi r squared. That's a lot of poop. But they do it. They make this huge big circle that encompasses 2 or 3 square miles of land. And other rhinos, no, don't go in there, that belongs to somebody else. So this is kind of a ritualized warfare. I see it up in my own home on the deck around my house. There's a lot of little lizards there. And a lizard will come up on the deck and he'll look up at me, and then all of a sudden another guy comes, and the first guy starts doing, have you seen the 4-legged push-ups? Seen the lizard? And their belly goes blue. And that's a warning to the other guy, this is my territory, don't come near it. And so it's like ritualized warfare. But when that doesn't work, then we engage with the real thing. So that's the downside of the awareness of other people. Species war with each other. Tribes of baboons will wipe each other out. Prides of lion will wipe each other out. And human beings have been doing it for tens of thousands of years, wiping each other out. Or we try to enslave them. And that's true not just as humans. There are ant populations that will enslave other ant species and literally make them work for them. And so slavery happens at every level. 8 human beings right now own 50% of all the money in the world. And so the rest of us in some size are enslaved to the corporatocracy. So the downside of the recognition of other people, the awareness of others, is that there's warfare, or there's enslavement, or there's competition. So there becomes a need for a third level of a breakthrough, a third great awakening. And there's the awakening into the understanding of the transcendence of God. And I believe that this happened maybe 50,000 years ago as a species, where we moved from being Homo Sapiens, which means thinking people, to Homo Sapiens Sapiens, which means people who had developed language. And there's a huge difference. Language is the ability, to mentally, manipulate symbols inside in one's head. So it's not just being able to think, it's being able to visualize symbols and manage the symbols internally, and that gives birth to language. And as soon as you begin to do that, to manipulate symbols and have language, you begin to ask kinds of existential questions. And you begin to start inferring from the data of your sensorium patterns that exist in nature. And you begin to ask questions then, where does this come from? And one of the first answers, obviously, there must be somebody responsible for all of these things. So there must be some kind of divine being or some kind of a creator. And so we happen upon the notion of a divinity or a God. So there's an awareness now of this transcendent being that lives elsewhere, typically a kind of a sky god. And this is a great, extraordinary breakthrough. When we have this great breakthrough, initially we're in fear of this divinity because wild things happen unpredictably. And so in the Old Testament it says, for instance, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. But there's another phrase that happens much later in the New Testament that says, perfect love drives out fear. So initially our response to the transcendence of the divine is some kind of fear. But then we learn to turn the fear into love. And so in fact, a better translation of the old Hebrew word, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, is actually the awe at God is the beginning of wisdom. So it's not fear in the sense of trembling in front of, it's awe in front of the mystery of. So that's the movement then we fall in love with this transcendent divinity. Now, the advantage then is there's this real love feeling. Now we want to align ourselves with some kind of a wisdom tradition. And so in the Catholic tradition of the Rosary, with the joyful mysteries, there's a joyful mystery called the Presentation in the Temple. And it's a story where at age 8 days, Joseph and Mary take their baby Jesus to the temple to dedicate him to God. So once you've discovered the transcendent, you want to try to align yourself with the cultural wisdom that tells you about this divinity. So that's the great upside to it, that you want to align yourself now with some kind of a wisdom tradition that will educate you and allow you to experience the transcendence of this being. But there's a downside to this as well. And the downside is that very, very often, rather than discovering God, we actually fabricate gods. We start making God in our image and likeness. And God looks suspiciously like, a human being writ large, with all our good qualities and all our bad qualities just magnified 1,000,000 times over. So unfortunately, this is the God that most of us, believe is a transcendent being. And that very, very quickly leads to the notion of chosenness. Every group wants to believe that somehow they've got a special relationship with this transcendent, fearful divinity. So Judaism will regard itself as the chosen people. The Maasai think that all the cattle in the world were made by God for them. So their duty is to repatriate all the cattle of the world. So they take all the cattle back because God meant all the cattle of the world to them. Roman Catholics believe extra ecclesiam nulla est salus. Outside the Catholic Church, there's no redemption. So we're special to God if you're Catholic. The Japanese have a belief system that they're children of the sun god. That's the emblem on their flag. That literally the Japanese were created very, very differently from the rest of us. That's the belief system, the old belief system, that they're special children of God. Now, I can't figure out how any thinking person looking at the cosmos, at the vastness of the cosmos, could really believe for a moment that whoever is responsible for all of this, looking down through perhaps millions of parallel universes, picks this particular cosmos and has a particular love affair with this one. And then looking at this cosmos of ours with about 200 billion galaxies, looks at one particular little galaxy called the Milky Way and says, and that's my favorite of all the galaxies in all the universes in the world. And then he zeroes in on a particular star in the Milky Way galaxy called our sun, and he has a special love affair with our solar system. And from our solar system, of all the planets and all the moons, he got a particular love affair with one particular planet called Gaia, our planet Earth. And he really, really loves this one, more than all the other planets in all the galaxies, in all the universes. And on this particular planet, he has a particular love affair with one species called humans. And of this species, he got a particular love affair with just one tribe, whether it's the Jews or the Japanese or the Catholics. How any thinking person could believe that of transcendence, but that's what we've done. So in a sense, that's the dark underside of the third piece when we awaken to the transcendence of the divine. So there's need then to go to a fourth awakening. And the fourth awakening is awakening to the immanence of God. In other words, God as she manifests herself through her creation. So this becomes very important. There's a breakthrough into the realization that somehow God is a fractal hologram, every part of which contains the totality of the whole. So wherever you see a manifestation of God, all of God is present, just like when you look at a hologram. It's all contained in every part of itself. And now, three of the other great mysteries of the joyful mysteries of the Rosary begin to make sense to me at this level. There's a story there called the Annunciation, where the angel Gabriel announces to Mary that she is to be the mother of the Mashiach. Now, that may be historically true, I have no idea. Much more importantly to me is the fact that the angel Gabriel was sent to every single one of us. And that the angel Gabriel told every one of us, you have to conceive and bear God. So this is the realization, the imminence of God, awakening to the realization of the imminence of God, is to be able to say, I am a child of God. And not only to say, I am a child of God, I am God as a child, without any hubris whatsoever. That for me is what the mystery, the glory, the joyful mystery of the Annunciation means. That every single one of us is able to make the claim, when we reach that stage, I am God as Seán, I am God as Ursula, I am God as Mary, I am God as Joseph, I am God as Callista. To say that without any hubris. The second great mystery there is the visitation, and it's the one that was read for us today, that Jerry read for us today, where Mary, a now pregnant Mary, is visiting her pregnant cousin Elizabeth. And on their meet, the two babies, recognize each other. And Elizabeth says to Mary, who am I that the mother of my God should visit me? Because as soon as your greeting reached my ears, the baby in my womb leaped for joy. Now we think this is a special situation where Mary is carrying God, And Elizabeth is just carrying John the Baptist, and both of them, Mary and Elizabeth, are just human beings. I see it very, very differently. Mary is a child of God, as really as Jesus was. Elizabeth is a child of God, as really as Jesus was. John the Baptist and Jesus are both children of God, and they recognize that in each other. It's the Christian version of Namaste. The God in me recognizes and honors the God in you. So here was the God, literally in Elizabeth, recognizing the God in Mary. Not just in the babies they were carrying, but in each other. That's it. So every single person, I can say, having said it of myself, I can now say, Emmanuel is a child of God. Emmanuel, is God as Emmanuel. Jean is not just a child of God, she is God as Jean Ramasiyati. So every other being is God in some kind of guise as well. So that's the great movement. Now, in the first stage, where we recognize the transcendence of God, we then want to affiliate with some kind of a wisdom tradition, typically the cultural wisdom tradition into which we were born, so that we can learn more about this transcendent being. Once we reach the stage of awakening to God's immanence, then there's the story of the finding in the temple, where according to Luke's Gospel in chapter 2, the baby Jesus, the child Jesus at age 12, is missing for 3 days, and his parents are freaking out. And they find him inside in the temple, and Mary says, "Why did you do this to us? We've been freaking out. Didn't you know that we were looking for you?" And he says, "Didn't you realize I must be about my Father's business?" So at this stage, Jesus is transcending his own culture and his own community and his own wisdom tradition. Not transcending in the sense that he's abandoning. Transcending does not mean abandonment. It means going beyond and incorporating what has gone before. In the same sense in which when a tree produces branches and leaves, it's transcending its root system. But it's not abandoning its root system. It needs its root system. They feed each other. So transcending is going beyond, but incorporating the prior stages. So Jesus is not abandoning his Judaism. What he's doing is he's reaching out to all of the other great wisdom traditions of the world. And there's a lot of esoteric literature that claims he spent time in India, he spent time in Egypt, he spent time among the Celts in Cornwall, in England. And so this notion that he would expose himself to all the other great wisdom traditions. And that's what each one of us needs to do as well. We have to expose ourselves to all the great wisdom traditions. We're trying to do that at the moment with our little children. On the second Sunday each month, we've had a family present some one of the great wisdom traditions of the world to the children. We started with Buddhism, with Confucianism, Taoism, Shintoism, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, etc. Trying to expose children to all the wisdom traditions so we can cull and take what's important. That's the great upside, to understanding the immanence of God. But the immanence of God also obviously has a dark belly, an underside, and that is the temptation toward megalomania, the realization somehow I am God. But I am God. Only Seán is divine. Everybody else is a pleb, and I'm special. And so there have been many people throughout history who've had this, dark underbelly, thinking somehow that they're special. Not just as individuals, but as institutions. There's an institution that claims, for instance, that it's infallible. So all other institutions, are fallible, but this particular institution is infallible. And you and I know very well which institution it is. So that's the dark underside of the immanence of God. When any institution, any organization, or any person, or any system claims specialness. So we have to realize that this awakening to the immanence of God must mean a namaste, a recognition of the equal divinity inside and everybody else. Which brings me to the fifth one, the fifth great awakening. The fifth great awakening is the awakening not just to self, not just to other, not just to the transcendence of God, nor even to the immanence of God, but to unity consciousness. And so at that stage we're invited to look back at the markers along the road of human evolution. And so the markers are the following. The first marker, we have to go from service to self into service to others. A little baby is born totally self-engrossed, necessarily so. We have to move along the spectrum, as we age, into service to others, until finally the majority of our service is to other rather than to the self. That's one of the first markers on the road. The second marker would be the journey from narcissism into compassion. From just feeling I'm the center of the world to realizing I'm a manifestation of the divine and there are other beings who are suffering that need empathy and support from me. A third piece might be the movement from, reactivity to responsibility. From just reacting instinctively to life on the one hand, to making, judged responses to life on the other hand. Another marker might be moving from programmed, belief systems, into free will, into thinking for myself. A fifth marker might be something like the movement from free will to freedom, or from my addictions to full freedom, because exercising free will is not freedom. Exercising free will might just mean an addiction to my own viewpoint, or addiction to my own need. Freedom is the ability to do not as I choose, but as God would have me choose. And the final one is a movement from, the final marker is a movement from a sense of separate identity. That I'm separate from God, I'm separate from you, and I'm separate from nature, into the realization of the oneness of all that is. And so in that sense, I want to just play with the phrase, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. If you've ever studied biology, you know that ontogeny is the story of the individual. Phylogeny is the story of the species. So ontogeny recapitulating phylogeny means that every individual actually reenacts the journey of the whole species. And you see this very, very clearly. So our species starts off as, a single cell, somewhere, a protozoa, someplace on planet Earth. Then it developed into a water creature, the great fish arrived. Then it became an amphibian. Then it became a land animal. Then it became a mammal that had emotions. Then it became a hominid. Then it became Homo erectus. Then it became Homo sapiens. And then it became Homo Sapiens Sapiens. And the individual person goes through the same thing. Every single one of us started off as a single cell, a zygote, when the sperm met an egg. Every single one of us were sea creatures. We lived for 9 months in the amniotic fluid. Every one of us finally became an amphibian. We crawled out onto dry land through the birth canal. At some stage, every one of us, became Homo erectus. We pulled ourselves upright at the age of 10 months or a year, and we stood upright. We became Homo erectus. About what age 2, our language skills are developing, we become Homo sapiens. We're beginning to be able to think for ourselves. And around age 12, we become self-reflective. We're truly Homo Sapiens Sapiens. But the journey does not stop there. That's, I keep pointing out, that's only halfway through the journey. There are at least 2 more phases beyond that. So if it's true that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, that the journey of the individual recapitulates the journey of the entire species, then the journey to date is only half of the journey. And so mysticism is the next part, because where phylogeny and ontogeny are historical, showing you where we've come from, mysticism is about showing you where you are headed. So in this sense, mysticism recapitulates both ontogeny and phylogeny. It tells you what the signposts are in the journey into total unity with God. So you transcend mere mind, you transcend even soul, and you become part of the Spirit of God. And at that stage, we're in the end game at this stage. At this stage in unity consciousness, you realize you've gone way beyond self-awareness, you've gone way beyond awareness of others, you've gone beyond God as transcendent, you've gone beyond God as immanent, and you realize that there is only God. That you are a dream, that life is a dream that the ego is having, that the ego is a dream that the soul is having, that the soul is a dream that spirit is having, and that spirit is a dream that source is having. So we are God's nested dream. And the trick somehow is when human beings begin to act lucidly and lovingly, God's dream becomes lucid and loving. And so finally, at that stage, you realize that there's neither an upside nor a downside. There's only an inside. So I think I have the energy today to open it up to our normal question-answer discussion. So let's see how it goes.
This whole journey toward altruism, that I've heard so many different people speak on Coast to Coast, that our lives really are not our own, and how we serve. This whole thing about being that 51% altruistic. We have our egos, we have our needs, our desires, all of our programs, but that really is what's happening. And I think at this particular time of our American history and our human history, we're really being called to really reach out to others through a much wider worldview of, there's a lot of fear, a lot of suffering, a lot of disconnection, but that's also being part of the stuff we have to heal. So I'm really inspired by your talk, and I think we're going to do it, and we're going to do it together.
Awesome, Ingrid. I fully agree with you, because we are at an extraordinary stage of human history. But I keep insisting on two things. We're not here by happenstance. We're not unlucky to be alive at this stage with all the kind of stuff that's going down. We volunteered to be here now. There's not a single person on planet Earth who's here by mistake or by coincidence or by accident. Even though 99% of us are asleep at the wheel, we have no idea why we came. We came here to wake ourselves up, to help wake each other up, and to shift the planet from self-concern into a Christ consciousness. So we're here by design. And there has never been a significant shift in consciousness or in evolution, either physical evolution of the planet or of the cosmos itself, or the evolution of relationships, or the evolution of the individual, that is not precipitated by some kind of a dire crisis. People do not change when everything is going smooth. It takes a crisis to create the next leap in consciousness. We knew it was coming. We volunteered to be here when it was happening. The question is now, how many of us are going to wake up and realize I'm here because I volunteered, and this is precisely the game in which I wanted to play. Or else we're going to be just overcome by fear and give up. And instead of contributing love and forgiveness to the equation, we contribute anger and anxiety to it. Yeah. Margaret. So just grab the microphone, Margaret.
I actually just have a comment, and it's a thank you for you, your comments on Jesus in the temple when he was 12. I've always had a big problem with that because it seems so rude and dismissive of other people's concerns, and it colored, and I think that kind of teaching colored a lot of Catholicism of, I'm right, you're wrong. I have the message, you don't. And to understand that it's a transcendence that we're all called to is really very helpful, and I want to thank you very much.
Fabulous, Margaret. Thanks a million. So we see this all over, that societies, parents and the bigger society are very, very happy, and they're delighted to see a child progress from being a little infant to being a crawler, to being a toddler, to standing upright, to speaking the first words, mama or dada. We keep applauding that all the way to about age 12. And then we don't want to go beyond that, because at age 12, kids begin to think for themselves. They begin to question, the family of origin, if it's dysfunctional in some way. It begins to start questioning the culture of origin, if that's dysfunctional in some way. Instead of thinking just purely ethnocentrically about the race or the church that I belong to, I now am beginning to think outside the box. And that frightens everybody. And the parents want to shut us down, and society wants to shut us down. So age 12 is very significant, because that's the end of the growth as far as society. They don't want us growing beyond that. And Jesus is demonstrating, and every teenager is demonstrating, that you have to think outside the box. You have to look for truth wherever truth is to be found. Because every group is going to manage truth, and toxify it some way. I use the image sometimes of where I live, I'm totally off the grid. I got my own septic system, I got my own solar system, I got my own water system. So I have a well that goes down 260 feet. And it's fed by ice water coming from the Sierras underground. Beautiful, beautiful water. But it's coming up through very, very many layers, geological layers. So there's lead in the water, and there's aluminum in the water. So I have to do a 3-partite purification system before I can drink it. Now, the water itself is like spirituality, but the stuff that comes to the top is like religion. Every religion is spirit moving through the toxic strata of organization and institution. And so it has to be purified. So you can't just drink straight from the well, even though the water originally was pristine water. Every system is going to corrupt it. Now it'll add some sweeteners to it, which makes it nice. It'll also add some toxins to it. So we have to make sure that we purify our water sources, our religious thinking, our belief systems, our cosmologies before we consume them. I think, who else was? Evelyn was next, and then Alfred.
have always lack of confidence, so I never know what I think is right or somebody else is right. So in that case, what do you do? Should I pray and shut up, or should I insist on what I think?
Okay.
Now, who is right, who is wrong?
Okay. Were you raised Catholic by any chance, Evelyn? Pray and shut up. Okay. Many of the kind of hierarchical systems, that's the model. You know, in Catholicism, it was pray up, pay up, and shut up. You know, that's what it was. So there's a reason God gave you an intellect. There's a reason that God gave you experiences. Because you're meant to contribute. You have pieces of the puzzle that nobody else has. And if you're part of a community or a family, you are contributing experiences, you know, and data points that other people cannot bring to the table. So everybody is encouraged to put it together. That's why we're trying, at least in this community, in our decision making, to try to adopt a Quaker model, where it's not by consensus, and it's not by majority rule. It's by consensus that everybody's viewpoint is valuable, and no decision is made until everybody present can live with it. So the worst thing you could do for any community or for yourself, Evelyn, is to shut up. You have unit. Now, how you express your opinion, that's the trick. Am I going to impose my opinion on you because I got the truth and you don't, or am I going to offer my opinion as a piece of the puzzle? But everybody needs to contribute their piece of the puzzle. Alfred was next.
Going back to the idea of the cosmos,
Okay.
I believe there's an infinite number of cosmoses, infinite number of suns, infinite number of Earth-like planets, and therefore we are insignificant.
Yes.
But that's not a cause for despair, is
Yes.
it?
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. You are no more insignificant than Seamus has 8 kids. There are families with no kids. There are families with 1 kid. There's a family with 2 kids. None of Seamus's kids is insignificant to him, and I know this from my reality. He's a hands-on dad, and he's now become a hands-on grandfather. He has 15, 16 grandkids, and he's a hands-on grandfather at this stage. None of these little beings is insignificant, and I'm sure if there were twice as many, they still would not be insignificant. So when you think about a transcendent entity, and you think about the kind of the acceleration of intelligence that goes with, mystical realization, God, whoever she is so beyond human understanding that even the most insignificant little planet in the most insignificant galaxy, in the most insignificant cosmos, and the tiniest little member on that, whether it's a banana slug, or a human being, is totally beloved of God. For God to love, is a total exercise. God cannot parcel out her love, 3% of this and 4% of that. For God to love is to totally be. The example I use sometimes, if all of us were to go out onto, the Eleanor Party Park down in Palo Alto, where Margie lives, and stand out in the sunlight, even if there was like 70 of us standing in the sunlight, we're not blocking the sun from each other. There's plenty of sun to go around. And the fact that there are 7 billion people standing on the planet, all trying to look at the sun, during the eclipse or whatever, the eclipse is available to anybody, who's in the right place at the right time. It's not going to kind of decide it can be seen by these, but I want to allow myself to be seen by those. So God cannot parcel out her love. So the numbers don't make any difference. Now, to illustrate this very scientifically, when I was doing my prayer study, I was in contact with a group in Oregon who had been doing prayer studies for years and years and years over plants, mung beans. And what they would do, they would take mung bead seedlings and put them in a box and then pray over the mung beans, and look at the number that survived, the height to which they grew, and the chlorophyll content of the leaves. And they would pray over some and not over others, and look at the differences between them. And one of the things those guys told me was, it didn't matter the size of the box. You would take a box with 10 seedlings in it, or a box with 500 seedlings in it, or a box with 5,000 seedlings in it, and the intention did not get diffused in any way by having a bigger target group. It was the intentionality that had an effect on all the living beings that were part of the intention. So the fact that there are 7.5 billion human beings on planet Earth, and 55 million on planet Zorg, God's love for all is infinite. Margaret, you're thinking furiously. Can you grab her? I could see you. I could see you thinking furiously.
I've been wrestling with this God business since we're talking about God. when I was a Catholic with a capital C, we talked about God. What happened to Yahweh? That's my question. We say the Our Father. We talk about God. So Jesus, at the time of Jesus, Yahweh was God. What happened to Yahweh?
Are you reading my mind, Margaret?
What?
Are you reading my mind?
I don't know.
I've
This is in my mind.
Yeah, I've just started writing another book, and the title on it is Yahweh on Trial, God Found Guilty of Crimes Against Humanity. Okay. And the second part of the book is Heaven Countersues, Religion Guilty of Taking God's Name in Vain. So there's the two parts of your question. Yeah? Great. So Yahweh is not God. One of the most shocking things I ever heard in my entire life was a lecture by Joseph Campbell when I was in London, and he says, the problem with Yahweh is that he thinks he's God. And my belief is the problem with fundamentalist Christians is that they believe that Yahweh is God. Yahweh is a creation of our own sickness. When you go through parts of the Hebrew Scriptures, God personally presided over the death of millions of people, literally millions of people. Leave the flood out of it. God, acting through Moses, who actually never existed, ordered the slaughter of about 1.5 million people in the course of 40 years in the desert. Joshua, who was lieutenant, presided over the destruction of a whole bunch of cities, including Jericho. Now the problem is, actually, it never happened. Jericho is probably the first or second oldest continually inhabited city on planet Earth. There is zero archaeological evidence that the walls of Jericho ever fell down. So this is a story, it's a myth. It's to try to inspire some kind of a belief system, which is fine. A story doesn't have to be true in order to be inspirational. But we have given obeisance to a God of our own creation, and we've called him Yahweh, for historical reasons. Yahweh is not God. And give me a year, and I'll present you with a book that gives you the evidence.
I'm looking forward.
Okay. Chris, and then Tom. Not a hard one, Chris. I don't want a hard one.
Yeah, it seems like in every group there's always someone with a pain in the ass perspective. And I guess today it's
And
me.
you're the guy.
I have a problem with the fact that, we're here, we're working through stuff, but I'm wondering why, if God created us, from the beginning, he created us with really defective thinking, defective brains. I mean, you look at anyone who cracks a book in world history has got to figure out something's not right. We're all little nuts. I mean, all we get through history is war after war after war. And if we didn't have this defective thinking, you would have one group of people going over to another, sharing what they knew, and how they could grow and make a better life for themselves. But it's all this conquering and war and all this nutso stuff. So, I'm a little confused why we got these defective thinking devices. It makes no damn sense at all.
Okay, it's a great question. Did you ever play Sudoku? You know Sudoku? You know that it's like a crossword puzzle with numbers in it? Yeah? Anybody? Yeah. Okay, so there's several versions of it. Is it a 9x9 matrix? Yeah, 9x9. And they all have to add up, in various ways to the same numbers. So in some versions, you're going to get maybe 5 or 6 numbers already embedded, and you got to figure out what the other ones are. In tougher ones, you have far fewer pieces filled in, and you still have to figure it out. If they fill it in everything except one, you get it immediately. And so it depends on souls volunteer for different levels of Sudoku. And you're going to come to a different planet. If you're really interested in really, really, really stretching, you're going to incarnate on planet Earth, because you're going to be given fairly defective equipment, and you're still being asked, given that kind of equipment, could you still come up with the right answers? And that's the first point. The second point is the realization that it's an evolving phenomenon. And even by human standards, if you look at our performance today, with all apparent unrest. And you look at it, 5,000 years ago, we've made extraordinary progress. The amount of violence on the planet, believe it or not, has nosedived very significantly. There's a famous book written by a Harvard psychologist called Steven Pinker, called The Better Angels of Our Nature, where he does a fantastic historical review, both in the literature and in recorded history, of all kinds of human violence, human on human, human on animal, human on life. And there's an extraordinary realization that we're making extraordinary progress, in spite of the fact that there are occasional blips. The 20th century saw 74 million human beings killed by other human beings. But you have to take a historical perspective, you have to take a reincarnational perspective, and you have to take a realization that the soul is committed to growing. And one of the ways you grow fastest is by limiting your resources significantly. If you want to be a great athlete and you want to kind of run in a marathon, you're going to run on sand with weights strapped onto your legs. Why would you do that? Because you're going to build up your quads and your calves in such a way that when you actually hit the tarmac for the real thing, you're going to take off. So these are the three considerations I would hear. You're here by design. You have the equipment you chose. The species have the equipment it grows. It's making progress, but we're volunteering to come in order to grow fastest by coming to planet Earth rather than another planet. So somebody else had their hand up. Tom was next.
Yeah, Seán, when Seán walked in this morning, I said to him, I'm really looking forward to his homily because I'm grateful to Lawrence. He's now sending out the readings before the service begins. And so here I am reading the Magnificat, and I'm saying to myself, wait a minute, a teenager could never have come up with this prayer, if you will. But then I wanted to hear your interpretation, which I very much liked in terms of Elizabeth and Mary recognizing the God within each of them, and the baby's actually stirring. So it's just, and then my comment is, so here's Pius XII. He creates this, and I want to at least give him a little latitude to say, this is the best he could do in 1950. This is what the population could handle. But in reality, possibly he did have a greater understanding of the God that dwells within each of us. So
you've asked three questions, Tom. Let me go back to them in sequence. The first one is, could a teenager have written this Magnificat? She didn't actually. It was written by Luke, but Luke was actually plagiarizing a beautiful hymn from one of the books of Samuel, where a Hebrew woman called Hannah, who was infertile, couldn't have children. And she would come to the temple every year with her husband to pray, God, take my disgrace away and give me a child. And so she's in the temple one day and she's praying, her mouth is moving. And the priest at the time, Eli, sees her and he thinks she's drunk. And he says, this is a disgrace. Sitting inside in the temple of God, drunk? She says, no, I'm not drunk, I'm distraught. I really want to have a baby. I'm pleading God to give me a baby. And the prophet is so, convinced of her sincerity. He says, I guarantee you, when you come back here next year for your annual visit, you'll have a baby. And she did. She got pregnant. She gave birth to a little baby called Samuel. And she wrote, right there then in the book of Samuel, is this extraordinary hymn to God. And Luke just totally plagiarized it. So you look at My Soul Magnifies God. It's almost an exact copy of what you find in one of the books of Samuel. So in some senses, Mary may have been reciting it from memory, because it was pertinent to her as well. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, what would my hit then be on the Magnificat itself? So I remember, for instance, I like today's translation because it says, my soul magnifies the Lord. Other translations say, my soul glorifies God. I prefer the from the Latin Magnificat. My soul magnifies God. And the reason is this. When I was a little boy, about 8 years of age, my father had a motorbike, 250 BSA motorbike. And I remember at that stage, one day he was home for lunch. He worked in Cork City and he would come home for lunch on his motorbike. And the motorbike is parked outside the car. And I had discovered a magnifying glass for the first time in my life. Maybe it was one of the lenses of my grandmother's glasses had fallen out. And I was playing with it. So I was setting fire to stuff, setting fire to paper and to straw. So I then went out onto my father's motorbike. And it was a plastic saddle. So I go, and I set fire to the saddle. And my father runs out of the house, clatters me upside the head, and grabs a fistful of dirt and throws it onto the fire. Now, otherwise the whole petrol tank would have gone up and I wouldn't be here today talking to you. So what I learned that day is that a magnifying glass is extraordinary. Here's the sun 93 million miles away, a nuclear reactor. And it couldn't set fire to my father's motorbike on its own. It needed this tiny little piece of glass to focus the rays. But the glass needed two components. It needed to be clean, because if it was smudgy, it wouldn't work. And I needed to find out the exact focal length of it. If I held it too far away, the rays would have dispersed. If it was too close, they wouldn't have come into a point. So I realized that there's a difference between othering, mothering, and smothering. Othering is you're too far away in a relationship and you're not providing support. Smothering is you're all over the person and there's no space. Mothering is finding the exact focal point in any relationship. And that was the greatness of Mary in her raising of her child. She knew the exact focal point. So that's my understanding of the Magnificat itself. Now to get to your third part of your question, Pius XII in 1950. There absolutely, as was pointed out at the very, very beginning, there's no biblical evidence for the assumption of Mary bodily into heaven. And so Pius XII had to really stretch in order to make this a possibility. Although the teaching or the belief system had been there from very early on, the 5th century, as Lawrence pointed out. It was called the dormitio, in Greek, the dormitio of Mary, the sleep of Mary. That unlike other human beings, because she didn't have original sin, and according to original sin, according to Augustine, original sin was responsible for three things. Because of original sin, our bodies are weakened, we're subject to sickness and death, our intellect is darkened, and our will is, disabled. So if you don't have original sin, then you have a clear intellect, your will is perfect, and you don't have to die. So that was kind of the reasoning behind the idea that Mary wouldn't have to die. Now, if she didn't have to die, why did Jesus have to die if he didn't have original sin either? But then that was because God the Father demanded blood. So that's a whole other homily. So that was kind of the thinking behind it. Now, the interesting thing was in 1950, when he promulgated that decree, the Protestant world went crazy. They said, finally, Catholicism has completely lost its marbles. They're making Mary now the same as Jesus Christ. There was only one great scholar in Europe who stood up and cheered. And that was a guy called Carl Jung. Carl Jung realized that without knowing it, the Catholic Church had finally realized the feminine face of God. Now, that's not what the Catholic Church had in mind. They were not making Mary out to be divine. But what was happening was Mary was sneaking in through a back door. Or at least Mary, the representation of the feminine face of God, was getting embedded somewhere in Catholic theology to give fruit sometime later. It still hasn't done it, because women are still not equal in the Catholic Church. You can't be a priest and a woman in the Catholic Church. But at some stage, that seed, inadvertently sown by Pius XII in 1950, is going to bear fruit, and we will fully recognize the divinity, the feminine face of the divine, and women will be accorded equal rights on planet Earth in our political processes, in our religious thinking, and in life in general. So unknowingly, Pius XII was the agent. He was smuggling donkeys, to use a Sufi parable. Bonnie, can we get a... No, we're going to get onto the tape as well, Bonnie.
Sorry to sort of go back, but I thought that Yahweh meant unnameable, or it is impossible to name, and also that you shouldn't dare to name. I thought that was the meaning of Yahweh rather than...
So there's an etymological answer to that and a historical answer. The etymological answer is that, speaking in Hebrew, when Moses wanted to know who this God was, because Moses was not a monotheist, Judaism did not become monotheistic for another 700 years after Moses' alleged lifetime. So when Moses had run out of all of the excuses, because he did not want to go back to Egypt, because he was wanted for murder. He had murdered an Egyptian. Yeah. And he had to escape. Now he's being told to go back. And when he finally runs out of excuse, he says, for instance, I have a stutter. I don't know even how to talk properly. And God said to him, your brother, is a very, very eloquent man. He'll do the talking. You do the acting. So finally, when he ran out of excuses, finally Moses said, when I go back and I say to the Israelites, your God has sent me back. What God are you talking about? Which God will I tell them? They didn't have, there was a whole pantheon of gods. And so what the divinity said, allegedly, was, Ehiya, Ashir, Ehiya, in Hebrew. Ehiya, Ashir, Ehiya, which is often, always mistranslated into English as, I am who I am. There is no present tense of the verb to be in Hebrew. You cannot say I am in Hebrew any more than you can say it in Swahili. You have to get around by a device which is called predication without a verb. So if I want to say in Hebrew, I am the king, I will say Ani Melech, me, king. But there's no verb joining them. So you have to infer the verb. It's the same in Swahili. If I want to say in Swahili, I am a man, I say mimi, mwanaume, me, man. But there's no verb. So it's predication without a verb. So what God actually said, Ehiyeh Ashir Ehiyeh, literally translated is a future tense. It is, I will be who I will be. In other words, whatever the occasion calls for, that's who I will be. So that's how God is identified. So the name Yahweh is a kind of an etymological corruption of this notion of I amness. Now, that's the etymological response. Historically, at this period of Middle Eastern history, there were many, many different gods all over, the Middle East. Chief among them was a god called El. And when finally, in the internecine warfare that broke out among the gods, finally by attrition, Yahweh comes to the top. So initially, Yahweh is just a tribal divinity associated with a particular group. Eventually, because of wars among the gods in the Middle East, by attrition, this particular god gets to the top. And eventually, they will claim he's the only God. So initially, he's one among many, then he becomes the most important, and finally becomes the only one. But when you look at his track record, not made up, as recorded by the book of Genesis, Deuteronomy, Numbers, and Joshua, this is a total psychopath, the number of murders that he committed. And so he's not God. He was a creation of a human group at a time, like we've created, we've bought the same idea, or like the Muslims have bought the same idea. The God of monotheism, in my opinion, is not God. The God of monotheism is a human fabrication. It takes all human characteristics, good and bad, amplifies them, and then pretends that this is actually God. So we have to start listening to the mystical impulse. There is a God, but this God is the God that Alfred spoke to us about, that loves all the cosmoses equally and every being equally, who is only love. There is only love with this God. There is no judgment whatsoever. There certainly isn't slaughter or murder or threat or irascibility. And so, we have taken God's name in vain. And we've been guilty of crimes against humanity. Guys, I'd love to go on. It's 11:15. We have a speaker at the end as well, so I'm going to call it quits there. So let's offer each other a sign of peace.